Well, hello, everybody. My name is Garrett Schmidt, and I am the CEO and managing editor of VBC Exhibit Hall. And I would like to welcome you to today's live webinar that is hosted by Milliman Med Insight, and it is called Contract Management Mastery: What You Need to Succeed in Value-Based Care Contracting. I'm particularly excited about this because this is my personal background in value-based care contracting, so really interested in this topic, and I had a little bit of a sneak peek beforehand, so I think you guys are really going to enjoy the presentation today. A few items of note before we get started. Everyone has joined today in listen-only mode, so this is a traditional webinar format, so you don't need to worry about turning off your microphone or your camera. We can't see you or hear you. However, we do want to hear from you, and we're going to have a time for some Q&A towards the end of the presentation. So if you have a question for either of our speakers or just in general, go ahead and drop it into, you have a module as an attendee. There's a place for questions, so drop your question there at any time. You don't need to wait until the Q&A to do that. And we're going to get to as many as we can. We have a big audience today with us, so we're going to get to as many as we can. If we don't get to yours, though, don't worry. Someone will reach out via email to make sure that we answer your question. Oh, and finally, the session today is being recorded. So what's going to happen is when we conclude, after an hour or so, you will receive an email, and it will have a link to the recording as well as to the slides. That way you can review that at your own leisure and share it with colleagues and friends, and we hope that you do. So without further ado, wanted to very briefly introduce our speakers today. With us, we have Mr. Umang Gupta, and here's a healthcare actuary and project manager. Technical product manager with Milliman Med Insight. And we also have Mr. Jonah Brulette, and he is the principal and consulting actuary. So welcome, gentlemen.
Yeah, it's great to be on today. Looking forward to the discussion. We'll get right into the agenda. I'm going to kick things off with sort of an overview of contract negotiations, the components of them, what we've found through our consulting experience to be the strategies for success, and sort of the key concepts that need to be mastered in order to maximize success under these contracts. We're also going to get into performance tracking throughout the year, how important that can be. So all the important components of negotiating a good contract. Then the second piece is managing performance throughout the year. So understanding how you're performing, not just in aggregate, but down to the individual participant level, so that you can hold individual participants accountable and perhaps make adjustments as needed. And then a final section that Umang will walk through is the various ways we think we can help via technology, via platform. So we'll get right into it. We're starting off with a poll question. So we just like to know who is in the audience today, and we've given you some general options that we think you'll fall into.
All right, and you should see this pop up on your screen. This is anonymous, by the way. We're going to have a few polling questions today. This is just to kind of get to know you guys better, and we're going to show you the results so you can see where you stack among your colleagues. So it's a way you guys can participate in today's session. Again, this is anonymous, so feel free to answer accordingly. And we've got the results are still coming in, so we'll give it another few seconds for everyone to answer. And I know that you might have to choose, but these days you can be all of these things. Um, but choose the best that applies. Okay. I think most of the results have come in right now. So we're going to shut it down in about 10 seconds, and then we'll show you the results here. Okay, we're going to close it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right. Are you guys able to see the results on your screen? Jonah, are you able to see and Iman?
Yes, I am, and I see a bunch of thumbs ups from the audience. So I think
All right.
it's great. Yeah, we've got a pretty even split here, really, a pretty broad set of participants here, which is great to hear. Um, Provider groups and healthcare system being a little bit above everyone else, and then closely followed by ACO. I think that um, aligns with generally what we see in the marketplace in terms of who we're working with. But we're working with all types here, so great to hear. And I think the content that we have will speak to all of these parties pretty well. Perhaps particularly to some of the provider group and healthcare system and ACOs. Specifically. I think, do we have one more poll question right at the top here?
We do. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the next one here.
So, second poll question here is how many risk sharing arrangements is your organization currently participating in? Really interested to see the results here.
Yeah, and of course, this is to choose one that best applies. And if you're in application of one of these but aren't yet participating, Jonah, how do you want them to vote with that one?
Um, yeah, yeah. If you're in application with one, I'd probably count it in the group towards the count, sort of in a forward looking way. What do you think your exposure to risk sharing arrangements will be going forward? I think is a great way to answer.
Great. And we're going to shut it down in about long seconds here. 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right.
Yeah, some really interesting results here. Not surprised that 5+ won out. That's certainly what we're seeing in the market. Is most organizations are getting into multiples of these, and I think what we're going to discuss today um, speaks to particularly when we have multiple contracts that we're participating in, how best to manage those and sort of break those down into the key concepts that can be repeatable across different contracts. What types of things do we need to be repeatably optimizing for our participation in all these agreements? So fantastic! It looks like we've got a group of people in the audience today who are in a lot of risk sharing arrangements. So I think the next bit of content will be quite meaningful. So what we're going to get into first is contract negotiations. Um, and we've got a series of slides here. We can go into them that indicate sort of what are the key considerations as we enter into these contracts. What should we be negotiating on? What should we be thinking about as key elements of these contracts that we're potentially going to enter into? We've got three main buckets here. So three kind of questions that we think are important to answer as you're going into a risk contract. What types of patients are you focused on? So if you're in a risk contract arrangement, you're going to be asked to produce value um, on a subset of patients that you are interacting with. Depending on the contract terms, those could be patients you are highly influencing, patients you are partially influencing, patients you are touching but need to take an active role in managing better. So understanding what are the types of patients you are focused on and how are you generating value on them, and would you expect that value to be seen in total cost of care? Um, would you expect it to be in episodes of care? Um, do you want to be taking total cost of care risk? Do you want to be taking only subpopulation risk? How that population of patients you're being at risk for is defined can make quite a large difference in how you perform in the program. One of the areas we see the most opportunity for improvement in these contracts is better defining the patient population, whether that's getting it all prospectively defined so you know who those patients are well in advance of you being at risk for them, narrowing that population so that there's less noise, more focus on the patients you're actually influencing and taking risk for. The general concept that's going to be present in value-based care contracting is we want the amount of impact and savings you may be able to drive through your uh, through your interventions, um, maybe relatively small relative to the total cost of care sometimes, but it may be real. And so what we want to do is be able to highlight that real savings that we are generating relative to the budget that we're being given, right? So we want that savings, the expected savings, to be a distinct and a definable part of the risk we're taking. We don't want it to be lost in the noise. If it's lost in the noise, we're going to have noisy results year over year in the contracts. The second piece of this is related to it. So which patients are you focused on? And then how are you driving down costs? So what interventions are you planning? What are the potential savings from these interventions? And how do you generate savings from the interventions? Do we have a back of the envelope calculation, uh, a feasibility study on the population at risk? And would you expect, if all goes to plan, to be generating savings on this? What is the variation in costs on this population? If the variation, your expected year-over-year variation in costs over these at-risk populations is higher than the potential savings, or on the same order of the potential savings, then we run into the risk of multi-year variation, sort of overwhelming what we're doing on the ground. So really important in these first two bullets to understand, who am I taking risk for and how am I taking risk? What is my value proposition? How do I succeed in this program consistently over time? And am I comfortable with that math? Really important to, to do it. And certainly what we found is not one size fits all. Depending on the type of population you're working with, total cost of care may be the best way to aggregate the true impact you're having, because you're having an impact across a broad continuum of care. Or if you're treating people in very narrow settings, maybe you want a much more narrow definition. You want to take risk for less patients, but on patients you are sure you're going to be having an impact on. So I think certainly one size fits all is not appropriate here. What we want to do is we want the planned savings and the patients that you're impacting to be appropriately sized to what you're doing, such that, again, random variation is not overwhelming what we're actually achieving in the program. And then finally, what is your risk appetite? This is the big question. I think this is a more complicated answer than many think. Obviously, we prefer as little downside risk as possible if we're going into these arrangements, right? But we might not, because what we really want is we want to optimize our expected value in the program. And that may entail taking on a little bit more downside risk in order to get better terms for how we're measuring savings. A good example of this, I think, is in the MSSP program. We have this MSR MLR concept. And what many people did was they wanted to maximize the MSR MLR. It was a symmetrical limit on losses and savings. So if you got savings within uh, 0 to 2%, you actually wouldn't receive any savings. And if you got losses from 0 to negative 2%, you wouldn't receive those. So you're getting a lot more protection on the downside. But what we've found for many participants is that actually led to, over time, for those that had a sound model of participation and a sound model of savings, that actually taking that additional downside risk protection was limiting their upside more. And what we found with many going forward in these programs is they're doing the due diligence to check that they're well positioned in the MSSP program, and then they're minimizing the MSR, many going with a 0% MSR MLR, because they believe over multiple years they're incremental savings that they're going to achieve. Maybe it's going to be 1% some years, but they're more likely to be getting 1% savings in a down year than a 1% loss. So we want to balance probabilistically what that risk appetite is. Minimizing downside isn't always the most advantageous way to participate in the programs and maximize value in the programs. What we may be doing is limiting our ability to actually achieve the savings that we want if we're too aggressive on the downside. So certainly we want to minimize absolute downside to the best we can, but what we really want to do is probabilistically maximize our expected return in the program. And certainly there's a lot of tools and methodologies that we can use to help think through that and maximize that. We can go on to the next slide. Um, so who needs to be involved during contract negotiations? These are kind of the four areas that we think are often at play and kind of the roles that they play. So CEOs, CFOs, that's really defining the risk appetite, really defining, and ultimately, is this contract worth executing? So feasibility of the contract, what are the risk terms that we can accept financially? What makes sense for us in a way that, in a business sense, is not going to put us in a bad position there. So that's really the goal there, is for the CEO, CFO, is to understand at a high level what the terms must be for this to be viable. CMO physicians, these people are within the contract process, are essential in defining what are we going to do to generate value. What are the areas we need to be capitalizing on? Do we need key metrics? How should the contract be structured? Should it be total cost of care? Are we worried about it being total cost of care? And we'd rather have something like, hey, can we, for this population, we really want to focus on ED and readmissions being lowered. Is there a contract to be made around those key metrics, or total cost of care blended with these key metrics, or some quality metrics that we think we're really doing well on and have value that isn't perfectly reflected in total cost of care? So identifying the areas of opportunity. How are we going to succeed in this program? What do the clinicians feel is our area to actually influence and be successful over time, consistently in this program? And then to help create interventions that can drive down the key costs, or drive up the metrics that we need to be driving up, drive up quality in areas. So that's their role, is to make sure that the actual math, to sort of vet that the theory behind the contract that we're in is based on sound dynamics on the ground. Actuarial analytics. This is my area of expertise, Umang's as well. This is where we sit. This area is to perform analysis across all. So we're going to perform analysis that's going to help inform the CEO, CFO. What is the risk appetite? What is your actual risk appetite? How risky is this contract? We need to understand that more so than just what's the maximum I can lose. That's important, but it's also important, what am I likely to lose if I lose? How likely is a loss? How favorable are these terms? And what percentage, and how many other contracts am I in? And does this balance well with those? Things like that. So analytics to help support the CEO, CFO. When we have the input from the CMO and physicians, are what they're saying, are the interventions, can we price those out? They have ideas, clinical ideas on how they're going to drive value. Can we look at data? Can we look at benchmarks and price that out and validate that this idea should play out in the contract terms as they're stated, to generate value and generate return on this program for you? A huge part of analytics, there's sort of two areas here. Analytics you perform before you get into the contract as you're negotiating, which is testing out the theory, looking at historical data that you have and benchmarks, and testing how well this contract would have done on past periods, and how confident you are that will port forward into the future. And then real-time information, this sort of second bullet, real-time information to CMO physicians to identify if there is success mid-contract. So we can do things throughout most of these contracts in the year. We're limited, there's lag and there's information gaps, but we can tell about halfway through a year how we're doing towards our goals. And it's important that we relay those to the key parties, so that if things can be improved throughout the contract, that we can move in the right ways to maximize performance in the contract. So analytics have two main roles in actuarial: defining that risk, really quantifying it on the front end, and then also managing that risk effectively as we move forward through the contract and into renewals, and whether we need to pivot. And then the final item here is legal. They need to capture all of this in legal terms, and make sure that that there is adequate protection for downside risk and things of that nature. And again, I think that lives downstream of the other three. We'll go to the next slide here. And I'll go through these relatively quickly here, but key contract terms, what this represents is what are the things about the contract within value-based contracts that we find are highly important to define well, and how the definition of these things has a large impact on performance within the contract. Length and term. How is your benchmark getting set? And how long are you going to get that benchmark for? How is it? How often are you reconciled? What's the process for renewal? Does your benchmark change every year over year? Do you get to keep a benchmark for some period of time and it's trended forward? So length and term can define. We generally find longer term contracts um, tend to have more opportunity if they're well set up, are going to give you more opportunity to perform on the terms of that initial agreement and have less of sort of circling the drain, chasing your own savings year over year in a contract. So having an increased length or term can be beneficial to the participant in that you get more time to effectuate your impact on the population and realize that before the contract renews and you're subject to sort of new random variation, things like that. Assignment attribution, we touched on this in an earlier slide, so I won't go into it too much, but how are you getting assigned patients? Do those patients that you're being assigned align well with your interventions, with your impact on the population that you're expecting? Any noise you're getting, any excess patients you're getting that aren't your prime target patients are potentially risk. Um, we can analyze it. They don't necessarily represent bad risk, but they are risk because really how we're driving value in these programs is by having an impact on the patients that we are designed to have an impact on. Anybody who we think we're going to have less of an impact on or be less able to impact is going to be a risk for us in the program because they could end up higher cost or lower cost, and we have less impact over them. So we want influence over how we're getting assigned population. Is it prospective? Is it retrospective? That can make a huge difference depending on your care model, depending even within MSSP, where we have a pretty well-defined primary care attribution. We find ACOs that perform 2 to 3% better under prospective than they do under retrospective. Both ways. Some do better under retrospective than they do under prospective. And it's all down to how patients are being attributed, how patients are flowing to your providers. Are they coming in the midst of an acute episode? And then you're managing that cost. Well, maybe we want a care model that allows us to show value a year out from when they came to you, as opposed to during the year in which they came to you. What's the attribution and assignment methodology that creates appropriate, that aligns incentives appropriately with what you're doing, and again, doesn't expose you to costs and risks that you're less in control of? Generally, what we want here is risk is fine, but we want risk that we have influence over, not risk that is random. Risk sharing arrangement. Got into this with what do we want to do in terms of downside and upside. We want to maximize what we get when we generate savings. Think of it this way: savings in one year can pay for poor performance in another year. And in some of these contracts, you get paid more when you win than you do when than you pay out when you lose. Over time, that can be maximized to your benefit. So even if we're in a highly volatile arrangement that has variation, making sure that our expected return over multiple years is good is more important than just minimizing downside. As we minimize downside, we may end up just coming back more towards a zero than we are towards maximum value under the contract. Target creation, talked about this a little bit in length and term. What this is how are we setting your budget? Huge amount of variation here. There are many, many, many different ways to set a target based on historical data. How old is that historical data? Is that population representative of your population today? If not, how is it being risk adjusted? Is that risk adjustment appropriate? Are you in an MA deal, and the nature of who's in MA is changing over time, so that the market for who's in there has changed over time. A lot of things to consider here. What we want is a target that is fairly set. It is very easy in these programs to have a target that does not represent where you land. And one key aspect that we often find is when a overall payer, whether that be CMS in the MSSP program, is setting target creation terms, generally If there's a unifying model like MSSP, overall at the nationwide level, or even at any scale, the target creation is going to be sound and do what it's meant to do, and be just fine. But for individual participants, it can create a lot of winners and losers. Even if the overarching themes are sound, individual participants can suffer if it's not specific enough. So your goal as as an individual participant is to make sure that the target creation, while I'm sure it is set well at the high level, is not overpaying some and underpaying others, in which case you might be getting underpaid. So good analytics to understand how that target is being set. Is it likely to be adequate for the coming year? And then the final thing is data. Make sure you're getting good data and timely data throughout the year. And we're almost to Mong's section where we'll get into some of the use cases for that. But it's very important that you have good visibility into how you're performing in these contracts as you're moving through the contracts. Go to the next couple slides here. I'll go into this section and I'm going to hand it off to Mong sort of midway through this section, but tracking performance. So those are kind of the key terms. That's all the stuff that needs to be done on the outset of being in a contract. And here's some of the things that we need to be tracking as we're in a contract. So once we're in a contract, how do we best manage that risk that we're in? So from 21 to 23, 65% of MSSPs achieved savings. Those that did generally generated a lot of savings. So a general concept here is we want to be generating a healthy amount of savings. That's really the MO for participation is if you're optimizing your participation in these programs, you should have buffer in the program. If you're managing these well, they're the high performers are generally making a healthy amount of savings in these contracts if they're managing all these key terms well. Curated participant lists. Understand who's in your benchmark, who's in your VBC contract, why they're in there, and that they're performing. Knowledge of how program methodology impacts your performance year over year. So all of that stuff we just talked about, all the nuances of program methodology, how it changes, and what's coming down the pike. Hey, I'm going to get renewed in 2 years. How's that going to influence my benchmark and my performance? What do I need to do to optimize that? And then awareness of how your expenditures and risk trend compared to others within the region and nation. How you trend in terms of expenditure and risk is largely, most of these contracts are going to have to take a historical benchmark and trend it forward into a future period. So a lot of the name of the game in a lot of these contract performance is actually beat trends going forward, beat either risk or expenditure trends or both going forward. And that's how you're going to perform. And how do we track that? We're generally going to track that at the individual participant level. We can go to the next slide. This kind of just summarizes the key levers here. High performing providers, we want to improve our risk coding. We want to manage inefficient utilization, meet quality outcomes, manage leakage referrals, and then contract management, which is sort of all the stuff we just talked about. These are all the key levers. If we go to the next slide, we'll kind of get into how we're going to operate on some of these things. So as we're monitoring performance, really what we want to be doing is monitoring performance down to the individual participant level. We want to see how is each one of our, and it can be individual physicians, it can be above a physician, but in most of these contracts, there is a way to actually judge how individual physicians with the beneficiaries they're bringing along are performing against their benchmark on a risk-adjusted basis. And contributing to the overall gain loss of the ACO. And that's really that's the structure we want to build up our performance tracking on. We want to be able to track it all the way down to an individual participant so that we know which participants are overperforming and underperforming. And then we can assess whether that's random variation, it could be, or whether we're seeing consistent patterns and we need to communicate something different to those underlying participants so that we know so that they can perform more in line with the rest of our participants or bring them in line if they are an outlier. We'll go to the next slide here. And that's really where um, our what Umang's going to dive into, and I'll hand it off to him here. That's really what our platform and our data analytics for monitoring performance in real time goes towards, is tracking which groups are bringing you attribution and which groups and how are they performing against their benchmark, and then how are they contributing to the net savings of the ACO in total.
Cool. All right, thanks, Jonah. We can go to the next slide. I have a couple more of just tracking specific portions of contracts. So one of the pieces that we talked about earlier was who are the members and what are the interventions that you're going to actually be implementing during the value-based care contract. And then we need to be able to track how that actually generates any sort of savings. So as Jonah said, we can do this at the individual group level, or we could do this at the entity level. But one of the most important things to note is that usually it's not possible to reach every single member when doing these outreaches. So interventions or touch points need to be pretty targeted and effectively targeted if they're going to be successful. So one way that we've seen success in doing this is identifying members who are high cost or who have a specific condition in which your group is specialized to take care of. For example, when you have high ED utilization, you may want to focus on getting more members preventative care or shifting some of those costs out of the expensive ED into some lower cost office visits or even telehealth, which has been pretty effective recently. Once you've identified cohorts of members, tracking the number of interactions between the member and the physicians will help determine the costs of the intervention. It isn't enough to just figure out that a person needs additional help, but you also need to keep track of how much it costs you as the group to calculate some ROI. You know, if you're only saving a couple bucks on each individual person, but you're generating like 10 office visits for that individual, it's not necessarily going to save you money on the target, even if the member is better off for it. Interventions typically have a limited number of touch points. So to determine the effectiveness, you'll need to find members of a similar type that did not have that touch point. So we want to think about that when we're effectively doing some sort of cohort matching study here, right? We want to compare the future costs of members who were not receiving those interventions to a group that has similar conditions who did receive those interventions. That gives you sort of a comparison of how well your intervention does on a sort of member risk adjusted basis. Cool. Next slide, please. So this brings us to just tracking performance for reconciliation of your value-based care contract. While tracking the details are important, you also need to know where the rest of the population stands in order to effectively understand the financial picture, unless you're taking risk on a very small subset of the population. And that's going to typically start with detailed claims and membership data in which you identify that attributed population, calculate their expenditures, and account for any adjustments. A lot of the adjustments that we see are things like carve-outs for high-cost drugs, or if you have any stop-loss arrangement on top, or reinsurance that protects you from high-cost claimants. Doing all those calculations happens first. Second is identifying the claims that are at risk and then trending them forward to project your claims till the end of the year. So you know who your members are, you know what their claims are, partial way through the year, maybe 5 or 6 months through the year. You need to apply completion, seasonality, trend, all these important actuarial factors to consider when projecting out to see where you expect the claims to be. And then you can also do projections for additional interventions that you think you may have. So, hey, we didn't do intervention X for the first half of the year. We think it's going to generate about 2% claim savings. Let's see what that does to our projected expenditures at the end of the year. And on the flip side, from the expenditures, you obviously have your target and your benchmark. The levers for benchmarks are pretty few and far between, but the big one is obviously risk score changes. So if you're focused on coding improvements or population shifts, you're going to need to be able to track what your target is throughout the year and to make sure that the expenditures that your attributed population is actually utilizing are going to be covered with the target that's provided to you. And I think the biggest piece of this is that a lot of this information is not provided to groups often enough. And it's hard to find actionable steps throughout the year for your care management teams to head off any sort of negative emerging experience. So I think this brings us to the last poll of the day, which is how are you guys tracking, these projections of claims and expenditures and performance currently for your arrangements? And it sounds like a lot of you had, more than one. So curious to see how you guys are doing that now.
Okay, so you will see the final poll get put on your screen. There you go. And how are you tracking your performance and risk arrangements throughout the year? And if you're just joining us, we've done a couple of these polls already, but feel free to participate in this last one. These are anonymous, and we will show the results here shortly, but we'll wait for the results to come in. Give it a few more seconds. And this is choose all that apply. Okay. The results are still coming in, but they're slowing down, so we'll close it down in about 10 seconds. All right, about 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay. Are you guys able to see the results, Jonah and Iman?
Yep, I can see them. So it's good to know that almost everyone is tracking, aside from a select few. So it's good to hear. And then a lot of you guys are using maybe a mix of internal analytics and payer reporting, and then a handful of people also using consulting or other vendor services. So what we're going to talk, or what I'm going to talk to you about, is how Milliman MedInsight is working through this currently. And starting with what are the main problems that we see clients coming to us with when they're trying to track this performance for their contracts. So we find that these issues are stemming from one of these 4 main buckets. The first of which is standardization, meaning that for groups that are in contracts with multiple different organizations, the reporting that they receive is not going to be consistent. You may get member level reporting for some contracts while you only receive aggregate level data reporting for another. And then because the data is inconsistent, groups without analytic teams struggle to process all of the claims data into any sort of meaningful insights. Second, we have detail. I think this goes hand in hand with the standardization. One thing that we hear is that ACOs want to equitably share savings to their providers based on their performance. And that can be difficult when reporting does not come at the level that you need it to calculate those distribution payments. Oftentimes, this calculation requires going into claim level detail and member detail in order to calculate fairly, which again is difficult to do without large analytic teams or tools. Third, and sort of, I think one of the more important ones is timeliness. If we take MSSP, for example, here, while they provide detailed claims and member month data on a monthly basis, they don't really provide a lot of information on the target until after the performance year is over. They do provide a little bit on the quarterly expenditure report, but again, that's usually not frequent enough to be able to track your performance throughout the year. And that means it's very difficult to, project any financials out, or it's very difficult to identify if you're doing poorly and have time to right the ship before the end of the year. And then lastly, we have an audit functionality. So if you're only using one set of reporting to do all this analysis, there could be mistakes, right? These arrangements can contain a lot of unique parameters. You can start with a basic risk share, but a lot of them will add on quality measure payments or reinsurance payments. And all of those intermingled calculations can get tricky. And there's opportunities for when running these calculations that could result in incorrect settlement payments. Let's go to the next slide. And so how we aim to help with this, we've done this work a lot on the consulting side, and we've now tried to create a tool that lets you do a lot of this, in a nice web interface, what we're calling value-based care contracts application. The application that we developed is aimed to helping out each of those 4 buckets that I just mentioned before. So in terms of standardization, this application will read in data from any sort. MedInsight has any capabilities to handle any sort of data. However, your partner is sending that over and standardizes it into a form in which you can get claims and utilization information out of it, and that we can do projections across the spectrum of your contracts, across multiple lines of businesses, and move it all into one convenient dashboard. The MedInsight data pipelines are pretty robust, and they provide confidence in claims processing information. One of the big things that we focus on is that details portion. So we provide full transparency on the calculations for both the expenditure and benchmark buildup, as well as the calculations on the final settlement. This means that we make the calculations as close to possible as the contract administrator, so that if there is a discrepancy between our calculations and the final settlement, groups can take our calculations to help jumpstart conversations about the discrepancies, or if there's issues in their payments. For timeliness, the goal is to provide performance updates on a monthly basis. As soon as we get a new claims data feed, we're able to process it. Now in the cloud, instead of weeks it used to take, now it takes a matter of hours, days on the long end now. And so we're able to turn around these projections pretty quickly at this point. And then finally, again, just going back to detail real quick, it's important to understand the performance within different subgroups of physicians. With the tool, you'll not only be able to see the projections for the entire organization, but also gain loss at the physician/TIN level, and that's defined by the user. That means you can dig into how each group is performing relative to their own benchmarks, not necessarily just the benchmark of the entire ACO, going back to the slide that Jonah had shared earlier. So I have a few more slides, just a couple of screenshots, and then we'll open up to questions in about 5 minutes, I think. So yeah, the screenshot here, VBC contracts, main goal is to provide current year financial projections with comparisons to previous years. We can provide those projections for a variety of contracts. A lot of our clients currently are using it for MSSP and REACH, but we are able to onboard, custom commercial Medicare Advantage and Medicaid contracts into the application. One of the more powerful features that this application has is user-based scenarios. So while your projections do come with, actuarial not certification, but like actuarial methodologies in the back end, you can work with a Milliman consultant or with your team at your organization to develop scenarios to adjust, expenditure projections or target projections based on future interventions. So let's say you have, a coding improvement in the next 3 months, you think it's going to increase your risk score by 3%. That's not in the base data. You can go into this user-based scenario section, increase your target by 3%, and see what that does to your financial picture at the end of the year. And you can do that, and you can see how that impacts each of the individual providers as well. And then one of the other nice features that I think is there is that you'll be able to export the projected claims and membership, at the provider, the subgroup level into Excel. So if you need to do any extra modeling, you can do that pretty easily. So next slide, we'll do a few more screenshots here. So on the left, want to focus on how we are pretty transparent about how we're going to calculate this. Like I said, it's really important to us, and it should be to you, that the calculations when you're doing these projections is as close to the real thing as possible. So we're going to show you every single step that we take in order to calculate that projected shared savings and losses, starting from, hey, this is what your expenditures are year to date. This is what we think is the projected completion, seasonality, etc. And then here's your BY3 target, and then here's the current trends, and then here's your risk ratio, and then feed that through, I think, whichever track you're in to get your shared savings. Again, with the goal that every calculation that happens in this application should tie out to your final settlement that you receive from your partners. Showing you the scenarios here. So the nice thing about the scenarios is that they're shared across your entire team. So I can go in, make a scenario, and Jonah can go in on his side and say, oh, look, Umang made this conservative scenario. Let me take a look at it, make sure that I'm okay with it. Or, hey, I want to make an optimistic scenario. And you can see everyone's scenarios, and you can flip between them, and it'll filter the entire interface to that scenario for that specific contract. Last slide for me is the next one, I think. And so just a couple more quick screenshots. Again, provider group performance we think is really key in being able to dig down into how, which providers are actually generating those savings for you. And so we have a whole suite of charts and tables to let you dig into, hey, where is provider group one relative to all of their other peers within a certain contract. And so in this case, you can see group one is middle of the pack performance. They're not super high performing, but they're also not generating losses for you. So is there something that they can do to achieve a little bit more, or is it something, is the one that's at 40% in the MSSP just an outlier, just having a super lucky year? Those are things that you can dig into in the application. And then one of the, again, nice feature is that, hey, you can come here as a one-stop shop, and you can say, all right, I have my 5 or 6 different risk contracts. Let's put them all into one interface, and I can see what my projected savings and losses are for the year across all my lines of business, across all hundreds of thousands of lives that we're managing. So that'll wrap it up for the contracts demo. We'll open up to questions here.
Okay, we do have some questions that have come in quite a bit, actually. If you do have a question for either of our speakers or just in general, go ahead and drop it in now to your attendee module. There's a place for questions. We're going to get to as many as we can. We got a big audience today, so if we don't get to yours, don't worry. Someone will make sure to reach out via email afterwards. So, in no particular order, let's start with this one. Who in the organization typically manages the overall process?
Yeah, I'll take this one. I would say within most of the organizations that we work with, there is a defined um, sort of VP or someone who sits over value-based care arrangements, who then works pretty closely with like a CFO. Sometimes it is the CFO, um, but usually there is either a senior actuary or someone financially based who is overseeing sort of strategy and management across all the contracts, um, usually at some sort of VP level or something like that, or director.
Got it. All right, next question is this. Is there an ideal contract term?
It's a great question. I would say there probably isn't an ideal number that I could just state. I generally think the longer the term, like if we're in this arrangement to begin with, we want it to be an arrangement that makes sense for us right now. So I would generally say longer terms, there's a limit on that, but MSSP has been going with 5-year terms. From my perspective, that has been pretty advantageous for the participants um, in MSSP having that long of a term, and we have seen many of them be able to increase and build upon their savings throughout the term there. And then when it gets renewed, usually still be successful, but there's a usually a lessening of the savings upon renewal. So I would generally say that having spending the time to negotiate well up front and then negotiating some sort of multi-year term um, gives you multiple years to perform on the agreed terms. And given the volatility that's present in total cost of care and healthcare in general, and things that can happen that are unexpected, I think that multiple years to realize performance ends up being beneficial. And again, we think the terms should be favorable to start with. They should be achievable. So a longer term, I think, generally favors um, the at-risk party in a value-based care arrangement.
Got it. All right, next question. Do you find transparency in performance reporting at the group level is helpful in stimulating improvement via best practice sharing? We struggle to move our culture to this level of transparency. Perhaps it is not common to be this transparent.
I'll let Umang speak on this as well. I'll just say we're seeing increasing move towards transparency and gain sharing, direct and actually an appetite to gain share to actually have uh, skin in the game. So financially incentivize them to care about this. But I would certainly say at the and there are considerations that we can help you with credibility and all kinds of great actuarial terms that come into play. And I think what has people have shied away from is I don't want to share this and have it be wrong or have it be proven that it was just random variation and it wasn't their true performance. There are ways that we can track this over multiple years and grow in confidence that, hey, this has been lagging. It doesn't look like it's random variation. So in some forms are, hey, 50% of your gain share is what we calculate your individual benchmark and performance was, and 50% is we all ships rise and sink together, right? Is the overall ACO. That's a good way, but we found having some visible tracking of performance, possibly without enough direct initial compensation tied to it for people to complain too heavily about it or spend all their time complaining about why it's not working, is quite useful because then it allows that information to aggregate over multiple years and consensus to be drawn about who the higher and lower performers are, and maybe who's not well suited to this program or not, right? There might be good reasons that aren't their fault why they're underperforming, but I think it's essential that and most of the high performers that we're working with at this point are tracking at the individual participant level and dealing with the difficulties of credibility and things like that.
Wonderful. All right, next question. Is there an order of operations where a contract should flow through the key players? For example, should actuaries be involved prior to CFO involvement?
It's a difficult one. Umang, if you have any thoughts, feel free. I have a
Yeah,
couple thoughts.
I mean, I don't know that there's an ideal order of operations necessarily, but it definitely needs to go through all of the phases before it gets signed. So I think, in my experience, uh, an initial contract might not make it all the way up to the CEO, CFO level if it's, an initial inquiry. And so I think going to like the analytics team or even legal first, just to make sure that those are terms that they're familiar with and making sure that that's something that the organization can work with helps out a great deal so that you can present a coherent story to upper management. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it could be helpful for sure to get it to analytics first prior to moving it up.
All right, next question, and the pairs on the in the crowd may not like this one, but what are the best practices for negotiation of commercial VBC contracts?
Yeah, I'll say I think for commercial VBC contracts, what's really key is that we have a value proposition that makes sense within the spend level of the current population. As we get into more sick populations, Medicare populations, a lot of this stuff is a little easier to do in populations where a lot of stuff is expected to happen and a lot of care management is necessary, sort of on a day-to-day basis. That's overstating it, but month-to-month basis, where there's a lot of things happening. I think on a commercial side, it's really important to be identifying areas, pockets where there is expected levels of care management and spending that need to take place and things that need to be managed. Another concept in commercial contracts that we are seeing is more of a multi-year view. Sometimes value in the commercial space can be seen over a longer time frame than it is over a Medicare timeframe. So I think really keeping in mind where the value is going to manifest. Will it manifest this year necessarily? How will it manifest? There are actuarial techniques to get a year-over-year contract that is working on longer-term trends. Like, hey, we're seeing less people this year show up with, advanced chronic kidney disease than we would have expected, right? But it does require more careful planning than simply here's a patient population with total cost of care, and here's one for this year managed to this level. We might want something that's more based on chronic conditions or longer term outcomes that we're trying to manage.
Okay. Man, we have so many wonderful questions rolling in, but unfortunately we are out of time. But if you have a question, that has not been answered, don't worry. Someone will make sure to reach out to you via email. So go ahead and ask it, even as we're wrapping up here, and someone will make sure to reach out to you. But wanted to thank you all so much for the audience for joining us today. Umang, Jonah, it's a fantastic presentation. And obviously, there's a lot here, and we're going to be sending out the recording, so you'll get a chance to review it along with the slides. So I know I got several questions in that regard. But as we wrap up here, I wanted to encourage you all to head over to vbcexhibithall.com. And this is where you will find the Milliman Med Insight virtual exhibit booth, which has kind of a drill down of what they're doing in the space if you'd like to learn more about them and kind of educate yourself on them and their services. They're a fantastic organization, and you're definitely in good hands there. And of course, you'll be able to reach out to them directly through there. And on the slides, there will be a direct link to that booth that you can go check out. And in the library at VBC Exhibit Hall is where this webinar will be archived, along with a lot of other great webinars on a variety of topics in value-based care and articles and all kind of stuff. So head over to vbcexhibithall.com. I think you'll find a lot of great stuff there. And then finally, if you would like to reach out to the Milliman Med Insight team directly, feel free to do so. Jonah's and Numang's emails are on this final slide. And also, there is a webinar here that I wanted to let you guys know about, and I'm putting a link here in the chat to everybody. And this is going to be in February 26th, and the topic is Accurate Risk Adjustment Solutions, Enhancing Reimbursements and Patient Care. And again, there's a link in the chat. But feel free to reach out to Jonah and Umang or to me directly. I'm happy to facilitate an introduction if that's easier. But I wanted to thank you all again so much for joining us. Stay warm out there because I know it's cold in a lot of parts of the country at this point. And I hope you join us on the next one. Thanks so much, and bye-bye now.